Hello and Ram Ram. Welcome to the second video in the India Way Explained series. Today we'll be going over the second chapter, The Art of the Disruption. Before I begin, I just want to say that I'm thankful for the response my first video received. It's not an impressive number by any means, but I never expected to cross 100 subscribers after only one video. So once again, thank you. I really appreciate it. This video may be a little challenging to digest. I recommend you watch the video I made on chapter 1 before you watch this video, otherwise you may be caught slightly off guard. This chapter is probably one of the denser, which is to say harder to understand, parts of the book. A lot of the examples are going to feel really unfamiliar if your interest in international relations is more casual in nature. Regardless of interest level, there is definitely an information overload in terms of the prescriptions and observations. As such, I recommend taking a break every 10 minutes or so. It can get really overwhelming really quickly. Usually I recommend people read the specific chapter before watching any video of mine, but for this one I recommend watching the video before reading the chapter. As always, if you enjoy my videos or you find them helpful, please hit the like and subscribe button. That being said, let's move on to the video. The minister starts out by talking about how the best minds of our times failed to predict the course of events that led to China winning without fighting, while the US fought without winning. This phenomenon stretched from specific outcomes in certain geographical regions, this is talking about One Belt, One Road, to the realms of economy, political influence and quality of life. This meant that along the way, America lost its famous optimism. The minister says that something had to give. Things had been building up and would eventually culminate in a quote-unquote break. That give or break was the arrival of Donald Trump to the White House in the 2016 American election. I'm tempted to summarize this next bit, but it is so eloquently written, I'm just going to quote the minister. This obviously was not the only reason for that result, but through that one electoral event, the upholder of the international system turned revolutionary, and China, the rising power, finds itself defending the status quo, or at least the elements to its advantage. Just to break this down a little bit, the minister here is saying that the 2016 elections made the country that built and maintains the current international system that we inhabit, the status quo, to begin adopting much more radical stances that ran up against the status quo. While this happens, China, the power that is rising in the world, finds itself defending the status quo, or at least parts of the status quo it relies on for its continuing rise. This means that the world is seeing its two leading powers engage in cutthroat competition to quote-unquote win, doing everything it takes to be the first to cross the finish line. Everything and possibly anything. The impact of such behavior from both powers on each other and the world is now visible. Take the US. Under different, challenging but more mellow conditions, they would have chosen to practice the art of the deal, coming to an agreement or arrangement via negotiations. In a more contemporary and unfavorable landscape, however, they are focused on changing the terms of engagement, changing the very rules of the game. It discards what no longer works for it, a far harsher and less understanding posture. Deals may or may not follow. Overall, major powers finding the ability to be more accommodating will mold the times we live in. Quote, when black swans meet grey rhinos, the very nature of the habitat undergoes transformation. End quote. Black swans in common usage is referring to hard to predict events that are high impact in nature. Such events are usually rationalized with the benefit of hindsight. Grey rhinos, on the other hand, are highly probable, high impact threats that are neglected, which is to say, they are events that are pretty predictable and only occur due to people not paying attention. So what the minister is saying is that when these forces meet, the very environment in which these events are taking place undergoes an alteration, or in his words, a transformation. All of what has been described can appear alarming to observers, especially if events become the sole focus as trends are excluded. International relations, however, is an, quote, exercise of forging convergences and managing divergences, end quote. An exercise of finding areas players agree upon and managing differences. As such, these forces that are ever changing and sometimes butting heads against each other will continue to evolve while also coexisting with each other. At the extremes, these forces produce allies or create conflicts. It is more likely though that most relationships settle somewhere in the middle, as our world is so interdependent. Convergences among competing powers is not an unknown phenomenon. Please pause to read the blurbs posted on screen when they appear. Let's go through some examples. Germany and the USSR cooperating after the First World War, or more famously, the US and the USSR cooperating in the Second. In contrast to this, the bond the UK and the US share has proven remarkably durable. Somewhere between these two examples would lie the UK-Japan partnership post-Meiji Restoration that lasted for about half a century. One final example would be China's collaboration with the USSR in the 1950s and with Russia in today's day and age. The current US-China relationship is 4 decades old, which is not a short span in our modern times. If we were to ask who benefited more in this period, we may find ourselves getting a different answer than what we may have gotten had this question been asked 2 decades ago. However, because the time frame we are talking about is 2 decades and 2 generations have come up thinking of the relationship a certain way as a given, there is an attribution to the association being natural. Quote, "We ask why it is under stress now, when we could wonder equally easily why it lasted that long." End quote. All of this is a really coy way of saying that in the US-China relationship, the US was the one gaining disproportionately for 2 decades. This arrangement came to be seen as natural by 2 generations of Americans. Now that the Chinese have started to pull up to America's level by using this same relationship, the natural state of ties is suddenly seen to be under strain as America seeks to safeguard its dominance. Quote, "Beyond these 2 questions, what the world is arguing over is the continuing relevance of a system that the established powers devised, but which was used so brilliantly by the rising one to advance its prospects." End quote. The rising power here being China. Convergences tend to dilute as the players move towards closer parity or believe they are moving towards closer parity. This is as true for the US and China today as it was for the US and USSR in 1948 or for the UK and Japan in 1922. The first reference here has to do with the disputes that arose over the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and the breakdown of cooperation in governing occupied Germany by the Allied Control Council that effectively marked the beginning of the Cold War. The UK-Japan example is talking about the Anglo-Japanese alliance that came to an end between 1921 and 1923. The mistrust it fostered and the friction it created would play a critical role in World War II. The absence of a common adversary that drives these powers coming together also changes the situation. Examples: the defeat of Germany and Japan removed the need for the continuance of the US-USSR relationship. The lower salience of Russia has played a role in the changes observed in the US-China relationship. Social similarities, as the UK-US special relationship suggests, can be a strong binding force. Dissimilarities can be equally as divisive. The minister states it is tempting to see current events as an outcome of choices, dissimulation, deception, or even of egos. All of that may be true, but there is also the unending process of international relations at work. The events of 2016, referring here to the Trumpian wave, were extraordinary. It is difficult to exaggerate how remarkable it was that the most powerful nation in the world would change course so sharply. While saying this, it is important to note that these developments aren't a completely unique phenomenon. The prioritization of national interests to the detriment of international responsibilities that America First espouses is something to be found on both sides of the ideological divide. America First as a phenomenon has a history, the more tendentious or controversial paths brought up for criticism. Quote, "One might well ask what a Bernie Sanders foreign policy would have looked like. But in its earlier version, it was not yet an America of global magnitude, and that is the real difference." End quote. Magnitude here means importance. Russia also followed an America First-like approach in the immediate afterglow of the USSR's collapse in 1992. Other nations, big and small, practice a variation of this phenomenon to differing degrees, even if they do not admit to doing so. This has come to be due to a reaction of key political demographics, that's a direct quote, groups that make or break your election campaign, to the economic predicament in their countries that they link to developments in the world. Quote, "Simply put, global supply chains were perceived as an economic threat and immigration and mobility as a cultural one." End quote. It is hard for many in Asia to grasp the insecurities globalization has created in the West. It has created a left-right combination on economics and socio-cultural issues that has led to the success of nationalist candidates. Many thought that the benefits of a global economy that globalization delivered would outweigh the uneven distribution to be found within and between societies. There is just as much bewilderment as there is anger at how things have transpired. Quote, when the deep state joins the loud state in the US, a structural shift is well underway. End quote. Which is to say that when there is an agreement between those elements of the state's apparatus that work towards their own agenda, sometimes independent of what the government wants, and other elements who do work based on directives issued by the government, a fundamental and radical change is underway. The Trump phenomenon, which was once unexpected, has now been mainstreamed. The influence of global supply chains and who dominates key technologies had been adding to trade friction even in the pre-corona world. The reason the stakes are so high in this competition is because the variables involved determines the future direction of the world. Big data and key emerging technologies are being hotly contested over. Quote, the new contestation is about artificial intelligence and advanced computing, quantum information and sensing, additive robotics and brain-computer interface, advanced materials, hypersonics and biotechnology, end quote. Major powers recognize that whoever better harnesses disruptive technologies will be able to influence the world more. In light of this, trade disputes are starting to acquire greater significance, and the US may decide upon pursuing a radically different industrial policy that suits its national security needs. Theories of entrenched powers resisting rising powers has accompanied the emergence of new balances on the world stage. Examples include the UK-Germany conflict in the run-up to World War I and Sparta and Athens. This is just one aspect of a more complex phenomenon, however. There exists evidence of the dominant power aiding in the ascent of a rising power. An example is China. It was first assisted by the USSR in the 1950s and then by the US since the 1970s. Quote, the truth is that these frictions are not fully structural, nor always preordained. End quote. Friction between entrenched and rising powers are neither always caused due to systemic arrangements or decided beforehand. Quote, dissimilar powers such as the US, European ones or Japan have both made common cause and gone to war. Related ones within Europe have also done the same. End quote. Culture, interests and circumstances all have a role to play, but at the end of the day, it all boils down to quote-unquote calculations and aspirations. Both of these factors are derived from leadership choices and societal sentiments. As these variables come down to human factors, values and beliefs play an important role. A lot of the discomfort you see manifested in differences arises from key issues such as the relationship between the state, politics, society, business, faith, and the markets, expressed through matters pertaining to personal freedoms and institutional firewalls, separation of powers. Sociology matters when it assumes global proportions. This is the heart of the difficult situation the world faces today. As a result, finding common ground has become the hardest diplomatic challenge. It is debatable whether these contradictions could have been hemmed in a little longer, but the political outcomes seen in key nations has made asking such a question irrelevant. The Sino-US competition in its current form will be a long and hard competition without clear outcomes. The likely scenario is of a twilight zone, where shifts in geopolitics are compounded by leaps of technology. Compounded meaning made more intense. The rise of a new global power was never going to be easy, and an order waiting to happen will look like chaos till it does. In an interdependent and constrained world, this order can only manifest itself through tensions and negotiations, adjustments and transactions. What is allowed to take root will play a key role in determining the outcome. An America that consciously chooses to be a higher cost but more insular economy, a nationalistic but innovative technology creator, and a self-sufficient but powerful military will be a very different America to deal with than the current one. There will be voices that call for accommodation or a return to the past, but there is a third option. an America that retains the present day national security outlook but also appreciates the value of alliances. Quote, so how much the culture of disruption will lead to the art of the deal still remains to be seen. End quote. What does India do in such a disruptive world to advance its goals? The US and China will be key variables upon which much depends. This is not the first time India finds itself in such a pickle. We retained our independence in policy making through the Cold War despite the complexities involved. It wasn't a linear exercise or a straight and easy path. Adjustments were required when faced with stressful situations. Quote, after the Chinese attack in 1962, it turned to the US to the extent of asking for air cover. In 1971, presented with the prospect of a US-China-Pakistan axis and a looming Bangladesh crisis, it concluded a virtual alliance with the USSR. End quote. When the crisis faded, India reverted to walking the middle path. As Russia weakened and China became stronger, a new binary seemed on the horizon. It was natural tendency to transpose the earlier syndrome on this emerging one. Basically, reapply old frameworks of thought to new developments. But the time period that followed the 2005 Indo-US nuclear deal showed how excessive caution lost the chance to make anything more than marginal gains. The fact is that wanting to go back to the good old days only highlights our limitations and undercuts our confidence. It encourages risk aversion, not wanting to take risk, and prevents us from exploiting new opportunities. Given where India is in its rise, it is important that India make the most out of its convergences with others depending on the region or issue. When convergences of interest are multiple, it is best to distrust and verify. Because the state of the world is such that changes can occur quickly and unexpectedly, India must find a way to forge more contemporary ties, more modern ties on every major account. Achieving overall equilibrium, balance will depend on how it does on individual accounts. In a world where self-interest is not seen as something to be kept hidden, nations will do what they think is in their interest more nakedly. India must be ready to face the fallout of this line of thinking. It will have to fend off countries trying to impose influence by exploiting the difference in power, economic advantages, and connectivity dependency. It must respond in a way that the other party understands. This being said, however, it is reasonable to assume that even the most powerful players have little interest in aggravating ties. They too have to work in a world of multiple poles of power and greater choices. Given this, the future is one of managing differences and finding some stability amidst forces inducing change. This process will not be bereft of problems, and as such, it is necessary to better develop strategic clarity. Even with neighbors with whom we have serious issues with, there should be some hope that the engaging in a pragmatic settlement of disputes is preferable to continuing a difficult relationship. With all of this in context, it is important to resist the urge to pursue imaginary gains based on old constructs, old theories to put it more crudely. India cannot willingly let go of opportunities to leverage or give another nation the power to veto its policy options, especially so in a world where other powers are not limiting their choices. Modest growth in India's global profile is not going to impress countries that are used to admiring strength. Realism prevails when options are available to be exercised and are exercised. This applies to all countries, as even partners will try to better their end of the terms of transaction. The unruly times of today are a far cry from the soothing mantras of globalization that was heard a few years ago. Polarization has soaked through both domestic as well as interstate relations. What the US and China are doing to each other is difficult enough, but the behavioral impact on the rest of the world will be even more deeply felt. It will change thinking and, in time, create new habits and attitudes which will not be easily reversed, if ever. Some countries will imitate them, while others will simply chafe, basically become extremely annoyed. But one way or the other, all will react. When the smoke clears, a different global architecture will start to take form. New interests and equations will emerge. Our world will look like a bazaar, with more players, less rules, and greater volatility due to the single-minded pursuit of national interests. This means that goals are more immediate and approaches taken are tactical in nature. Structures have weakened as interest in finding common ground has waned. New York, Geneva, and Brussels are now symbols to rail against. Negotiators are learning that advantages are asserted in a more transactional ethos. The spirit of the times are characterized by increased emphasis on being transactional. There has been an erosion in trust, especially between countries that are part of an alliance system. Countries are questioning how much they can depend on each other. Everybody is fair game when big affinities, liking each other, are no longer able to overlook smaller differences. As nationalism rises across regions, talk of diverging interests will become more intense. While it is true that the world finds itself navigating choppier waters, stabilizing forces from an earlier era are also working. The caution of markets and the unpredictability plays a constraining or restrictive role when it comes to extreme competition. So does economic interdependence with political risk-taking to a certain degree. These constraining factors continuously contest the changes occurring in the world, generating heated arguments in domestic and international settings. This means that even as some nations resort to rough play in hotly contested competition, there will be those willing to settle for less. In the liberal world, this could mean limiting aspirations to pluralism or just the defense of openness. Believers and doubters tend to converge on relationships and expectations where outcomes are uncertain. Given the pressures and forces pulling players in seemingly contradictory directions, clarity and objectivity are going to be two attributes that remain in short supply. The chaotic nature of the world wasn't always the case. Until recently, the world was interlinked in its activities and confident in the thinking that promoted this. A global village was the talk of the town, and players saw globalization action in a number of different and practical ways. Technology was seen as the great promise that drove ever-increasing connection between players. The default solution to any significant challenge, whether promoting trade, addressing climate change, or responding to terrorism, was through shared endeavors. All of this has started to change. It is not that the me did not exist before. It was that national and global interests were usually reconciled or hashed out, as some of us would say, through a network of agreements, mechanisms, and practices. Intermediaries, alliances, regional structures, or like-minded partners stood between nations and the international community. The world, evolving since 1945, is seeing this paradigm eroded by the disenchantment with globalization and anger at mercantilism. Access to global markets, value of global supply chains, and reliance on global talent mobility, key principles of this paradigm, is under increasing stress. Players are increasing even as the rules weaken. The old order is visibly changing, but the new one is not yet in sight. The nature of relationships between nations being disturbed is important, but so too is the churn within societies. If the world is not what it used to be, it is because the shelf life of old normals has expired. Think of old normals here as what used to be the norm in societies. In the Western world, income inequality, pressure on jobs, stagnant quality of life, and blaming outsiders is now the main narrative. The growing resentment that was long ignored was given a voice through black swan events. Brexit was the warning bell, and Trump's election was the real thing. Targeting plumbers from Poland, ridiculing immigrants from Mexico, or severely criticizing refugees from Africa. Politics has mobilized around cultural threats and economic grievances. In doing so, it has revealed that the thinking of the established elites has become obsolete. It is therefore not surprising that their foreign policy outlook will also be questioned, whether it be advocacy of collective interests or arguments of common good. Justifications have not been hard to find once departure from old norms was set in motion. The unfairness of globalization and the dangers of big tech being two of the more prominent ones. The rise of new agendas has tested old players whose belief that power would socialize, that newcomers would internalize global norms, ended up being proven wrong. Across the world, it is making itself known through political nationalism that challenges the status quo. The developing world, especially Asia, presents a sharply contrasting picture due to its stronger growth rates and higher aspirations. But it is still in the middle of rebalancing, and declaring it a success would be premature. Globalization served Asia well, which is why many in Asia wrongly assumed that their optimism about it was shared universally. When global convergence weakens, its advocates everywhere find their positions undermined. As alliances erode and the US scales back its major international commitments, the anxiety that this produces may be wider than what we may think, which is to say that the anxiety won't just be felt in one specific area but across the board. Once globalization comes under attack, all its aspects are subject to pressure. Opposition to globalized business will see the rules that govern it and the institutions that oversee it bear the brunt of attempts at subversion and severe criticism. A worldview such as this will also come to resent those international commitments that do not serve its immediate goals. It is not a coincidence that the political counter-argument to globalization focuses on immigration and job security. These are the issues that resonate most among Western electorates. This despite the economic logic not being sound. Quote, "But the foreigner is a convenient whipping boy, in person as much as an economic competitor, and if their trading practices make it easier to do so, then apparently so be it." End quote. The Trumpian outlook projects global supply chains as taking jobs away from America, which by extension calls into question the logic on which a lot of business has relied on for years. A once generous access to the US economy now sees a muscular use of tariffs standing in its way. Financial policies and social pressures are seeking to bring manufacturing back to America. There are plans to decouple China from the Western world when it comes to sensitive technologies. How successful this strategy will be remains to be seen. The other reason for the current volatility in the world is the opposition to global mobility. This phenomenon itself is the result of more efficient economic practices and the spread of skills. Difficult times mean that hostility increases to the social aspects of such a phenomenon. Cultural insularity goes hand in hand with economic protectionism after all. At the end of the day, however, these pressures will still have to contend with business realities which have developed deep roots. Everything said and done, talent will be a major requirement when it comes to leading in technology. This is what has the potential to make India's position different from others. India is the only viable talent pool that prepares skills before they go out into the world economy. The economic merits of this overshadows the social and political aspects discussed before. Making itself more relevant to the global knowledge economy clearly holds the key to India's future relationships. The impact of all these developments on the global order will likely be visible over the next generation. This is bound to have many sides, each one a potential source of instability. The most obvious is that the world becomes increasingly multipolar as distribution of power broadens and adherence to rules of alliances dilutes. Countries like India or Brazil will demand a greater voice given the growing economy of each country. Germany and Japan cannot afford to be unaffected by a change in American thinking on Russia or Korea. As consistency starts to be questioned, many more nations will start to do their own thinking and planning. A more nationalistic approach to international relations will weaken multilateral rules in many areas. Multilateralism being cooperation between multiple states, usually more than 3, via an arrangement or institution. This consequence is going to be felt more intensely when it comes to economic interests and concerns over sovereignty. Undermining the working of the World Trade Organization or disregarding the law of the seas are not good signs. A more multipolar world with less multilateralism suggests that the future in the near term is going to be difficult. This does not mean giving up on multilateralism, however. On the contrary, it means taking another look at it and pushing for change, reforming the current order and its outdated agenda. It is important to note that the issue is not a binary choice where one either defends order or invites disorder. Confusion will continue to prevail so long as players refuse to recognize that key elements of the order are no longer working for many other stakeholders. All of this is going to bring up uncomfortable questions about how the rules are currently being observed in both letter and spirit. As major powers selectively advance arguments, much of the basic consensus that underpins the current arrangement will start to wear thin. The emerging world is likely to fall back on balance of power as its operating principle rather than collective security or broader consensus. Broader consensus is a fancy way of saying sabko leke aage badho. You try and achieve an agreement every member has signed off on. Collective security is a security arrangement between states that has the effect of saying you mess with one of us, you mess with all of us. You raise the stakes for a war, and the logic is that by doing so, you reduce wars. If you're thinking of NATO, just remember that collective security is meant in the global sense, while NATO, at least for now, is a lot more regional in nature. Textbooks will use the League of Nations and UN as examples of collective security. Now if you're thinking, dude, Ukraine. Yeah, not exactly the most robust theory. Anyways, back to the video. Remember we were talking about the emerging world falling back on the balance of power as its chosen approach. History has shown that this approach usually produces unstable equilibriums, or as every boy watching this video would say, दुनिया में full WWE हो जाएगा. World affairs will also see a rapid increase in frenemies, rivals who share friendly relations, usually because the relationship has certain benefits for the parties involved. These frenemies will emerge from allies who criticize each other or from competitors who are forced to unite in order to achieve shared aims. As touched upon earlier, a more transactional ethos, a transactional spirit, will promote ad hoc, impromptu groupings of dissimilar nations who have a shared interest on a particular issue. This will be helped along by the necessity of working together and reaching out beyond alliance structures. The combination of these developments will encourage more regional and local balances that see less global influence on their working. The minister says that the really uncharted or unmapped territory the US-China frictions will lead to is one of having to deal with parallel universes. This may have existed before, most recently during the Cold War, but not with the interdependence and interpenetration of the current globalized era. As a result, conflicting or differing choices and alternatives that compete with one another in many different spheres will rest on partially shared foundations. Stuff that opposes each other will partially share a common base. This dilemma will be seen in a growing number of domains, from technology, commerce, and finance to connectivity, institutions, and activities. The key players will struggle with the dichotomy, contradiction of such a parallel existence. Those who have to manage both will find themselves really tested. Even if relations between the US and China become far more hostile in character, it is unlikely that the world reverts to a bipolar system, a system where two states hold the majority of the power. The main reason for this is that the landscape has changed irreversibly. Other nations, including India, are independently on the move. Half of the 20 largest economies of the world are non-Western today. The spread of technology and demographic differences will contribute to the broader spread of influence by non-Western powers. When the global construct is less overbearing, we see forces at work that show how local equations are relatively more important. Even as US has weakened, China's rise is still ongoing and hasn't matured. This, when taken together, has freed up room for other powers to operate in. Both players use third parties to contest each other. This may contribute to a faster rise of multipolarity. The beneficiaries of this could be middle powers. Those with prior advantages like Russia, France, and the UK will find themselves with a chance to become more active again. Some like India will aspire to an improved position. Other powers like Germany will attempt to improve theirs through collective endeavors, attempt to achieve goals as part of a larger group. This will also be a world of Brazil and Japan, of Turkey and Iran, a Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, or an Australia, with a greater say in their vicinity and even beyond. The dilution of alliance discipline will only further assist this process. What will emerge is a more complex architecture or framework characterized by different degrees of competition, convergence, and coordination. It will be like playing expanded Chinese checkers, including with some who are still arguing over the rules. A multipolar world driven by balance of power will not be a risk-free world. Europe, due to its experiences with world wars, is especially cautious. Even dominant powers like the US, Russia, and China favor the balancing approach only for specific possibilities rather than a general approach. Past experiences suggest that unchecked competition often leads to violent downward spirals on a regional and global level. This is why international relations thinks of collective security as a safety net. Even if they did not always work, broader consensus via wider consultations, coming to general agreements by asking a whole range of players what they think, function as a plan B. The players who are most unsettled by the prospect of multipolarity are those who have functioned in an alliance construct for a long time. Unlike independent players, it is difficult for them to accept that the compulsions, forced to act a certain way or do something, are a good enough substitute for alliances. While others contemplate this with more nervousness, India does so with a more open mind. A more individualistic world means a world where the entrenched players are more open to newer players. Long held collective positions on matters become less rigid. The current way of playing the game through more bilateral means, relations between two parties, strengthens the tendency to make accommodations. The security domain is a good example of this. From the nuclear deal to the NSG waiver, partnerships in Afghanistan or the Malabar exercise, all display a departure from the old groupthink towards a more contemporary pragmatic approach. It could now extend to other domains. Friends who differ or competitors who cooperate are a notable quality of this emerging framework. Both express different features of constraints that limit the freedom of choices in an interdependent world. The rise of nationalism is largely responsible for the rise of friends who differ, while global threats are responsible for competitors cooperating. The belief that alliances are burdensome is a major cause of friction. Thus, we have seen the US break with much of the Western world and Europe in particular when it comes to issues like climate change. The Trans-Pacific Partnership and NAFTA are examples of how trade can play a divisive role. Another important area has been energy policy, where America has been highly critical of European dependence on Russia. On more specific issues, however, frenemies have grown as mindsets have changed. For America's global posture, the utility of the current system has come into question. However, the momentum of the past can help in keeping nations together when they disagree about the present. Despite differences of views, traditions continue providing basis for working together, even if this is done so unhappily. When it comes to being compelled to act on common concerns, a different motivation is at work. Issue-based coalitions of conveniences are seen on global issues like counter-terrorism, maritime security, non-proliferation, or climate change. These coalitions can be effective even if the cooperation is done in a reluctant and resentful way. Division within alliances was one evolution. Reaching beyond alliances is another. As the world has begun moving in the direction of greater plurilateralism, similar to multilateralism but with smaller group sizes, result-oriented cooperation has become more attractive. This is because they are better focused and can be accommodated with commitments that are contrary in nature. The growing need of sharing responsibilities has combined with an understanding of influences that go beyond formal structures. Asia has been the focus of such initiatives as regional frameworks are least developed here. India has emerged as the industry leader of plurilateral groups because it occupies both the hedging, strategy aimed at controlling or limiting risk for the country, and emerging space at the same time. Working with different powers on security, political, and developmental issues have shown that making common cause to unite in order to achieve a shared aim can be extended by pragmatism and imagination. A confusing and uncertain world is full of partial agreement and limited agenda. Its vague nature requires flexible arrangements that are customized to the challenge. These practices will not simply be more widespread in the times to come, but will also occupy a prominent place in the foreign policy of the states beyond India. A world of multiple choices is opening up at different levels. We see this at the big table where larger powers are dealing in a more opportunistic manner with each other. Through their behavior, they are encouraging the rest of the world to also do so. Given that global balance is so fluid, how local balances will turn out has become a subject in its own right. In the Gulf, there is a multi-cornered contest underway with faith, governance models, political principles, and balance of power all providing variables. As issues emerge from such a world, it is more effective for India to respond with engagement rather than distancing. The skill that diplomacy values most is dealing with contesting parties at the same time while getting the most desirable results. There is more pressure on players in a high-intensity, less structured game. However, climbing up the global hierarchy is judged by the ability to successfully manage opposing priorities. Dominating the global stage today is different from the older days. It was easier for powers to rise when the world was much simpler. Fortunes were made and unmade through a combination of national strength, international opportunities, and the quality of leadership. Having superior technology and practices produce decisive results in your favor on the battlefield. Today, however, the variables that drive power and affect calculations are many more. How they interact with each other is more complex and less predictable. Their application is happening in a world that is more constrained, globalized, and interdependent. Due to this, accumulating influence has become a substitute for much rawer exercises of strength. Strategy has gone from being about the use of force to the effective deployment of resources. Technology, for its part, has opened up options like weaponization of finance or cyber interventions. While this is happening, coercion has given way to persuasion and incentives. As a result, nations now rise in a different way without always seeing a signature moment of transformation in the country. A good example is the 2009 global financial crisis, when neither China, the rising power, nor the US, the power giving up ground, were able to fully recognize at the time the enormity of the tipping point. An increase in the influence of nations may be more dispersed and less tangible. Nevertheless, it is very real. No one doubts China's influence on the world stage, even if they don't dwell on how they achieved this, by running trade surpluses rather than shedding blood. Financial instruments, displays of strength, and connectivity projects have provided opportunities to assert power without physically clashing with competitors. This being said, the dormant threat of growing capabilities continues to form the basis of hard power. This explains why some powers talk of their past conflicts in such exaggerated tones so much. In India's case too, maintaining a strong military posture and carrying out the 1998 nuclear tests were essential milestones in its evolution. Its global image is equally the result of its response to the Y2K challenge, higher rate of growth, and global acquisitions by businesses. Power itself has come to have different attributes, and not all of them reside in the same nation. The US, for example, remains the world's technological leader by a country mile. China, while behind in this area, has used its financial and trading muscle to carve out a number 2 spot for itself. Europe is highly regarded for its industrial strength and quality of products, even though it has pursued interventionist policies beyond the continent. It is still seen as punching above its weight. In contrast, Russia has summoned its long-standing capabilities and by sheer willpower reinvented itself as a key player. So what is the global hierarchy of power is no longer an easy question to answer. Because it has so many facets and is played out more locally, we are back to the matrix of many sides, many players, many games. The area most affected by all these disruptions is that of the provision of global goods, supporting goals good for everyone. American parsimony, unwillingness to spend resources, and Chinese nationalism have renewed the debate on the subject. The vision and activities of Europe has also shrunk. There are few who have moved in to pick up the slack, with India being a part exception. Unwillingness to commit resources to a larger global cause is very much in line with a narrower approach to international relations. For example, debate on continuing troop commitments to Afghanistan and the Middle East, or responding to the corona pandemic. The situation is much more complicated, however, including respect for international law or responding to serious misbehavior. Another is the indifference to the most egregious acts of terrorism becoming the norm in a large geography. This is hint hint wink wink at Pakistan. India has a particular complaint in this regard. The ability of the global order to make people obey the rules in regard to a range of preventive measures was given credit in the past. Non-proliferation experts will confirm that many other nations would have gone nuclear if it wasn't for alliance pressures. A lot has depended on key powers being able to underwrite their commitments. If this erodes, it will have a profound impact on the calculations of many players. It will also make it difficult to reach understandings when it comes to threats in new domains such as cyber or space. The next decade will unfortunately be less generous and also more unsafe. Keeping this in mind, India has to carefully navigate the near future. Leading nations will be more nationalistic and create space for others. Power distribution will continue to spread and multipolarity will accelerate. Greater players will not mean better rules, however, quite the opposite. As new capabilities and domains emerge, global rules will struggle to keep pace. These developments will pose a challenge for rising powers like India that prefer greater predictability. If it can handle the uncertainty, its rise will be rapid. At various levels of global politics, balances of power will be sought and achieved. Loose and practical arrangements of cooperation will spread across different regions. Some will be made up of like-minded players, some will be made up of more opportunistic, others a mix of the two. Regional politics and local balances will gain importance. India will have to engage a broader set of partners more creatively. The transactional system will bring together frenemies who are grappling with the compulsions of globalization. Many will use the newer technique of finance, connectivity and technology. India will also need to find its own adequate responses, nationally where possible and in partnerships where required. Each of these issues is a challenge in itself and their matrix will determine India's future in a volatile world. India could rise in an incremental way, hoping to play a balancing role as new equations between players emerge, a path it was taking. Or it could become bolder and seek to determine agendas and outcomes. To an extent, India's hesitation in playing a leading role comes from its recollections of powerful players like the US and USSR. China, however, has shown that a developing country with a large population and dynamic economy can start to take on responsibility. India could do well in following in its footsteps, obviously at its own pace. That is, in fact, the calculation, or perhaps even hope in many quarters. A flatter world, a world where globalism has leveled the playing field, has been beneficial to India as its rise has been welcomed by many entrenched powers. American interest in working with India has been evident for the past 2 decades and has accelerated in recent times. Russia remains a privileged partner with whom geopolitical convergence plays a key role, even under changing circumstances, giving the relationship unique stability. In the aftermath of Brexit, a more uncertain Europe has a growing interest in seeing India as a source of growth and stability in Asia. China sees India as inherent to the rise of Asia and the larger rebalancing of power distribution in the world. An expansion in Japan's concerns and interests has created a foundation for a completely different quality of ties. Asian countries, especially those in ASEAN and Indo-Pacific, see the merits in India's ability to create a more multipolar Asia. The extended neighborhood in the Gulf has welcomed the return of India to its region. While doing all this, India has managed to retain its traditional constituencies of support in Africa and the rest of the political South. As power differential in relation to the world narrows, the possibilities for collaboration have expanded. If the world has developed stakes in India's prominence, the latter, in turn, can utilize that sentiment to the fullest. India's rise in the world order is going to depend on improving economic and political prospects. However, this requires a favorable environment as well as the leadership and judgment to take advantage of it. India's changes in regard to these 2 factors today makes a strong case for others to take India's aspirations more seriously. The correct strategic calculation requires the ability to properly understand the transformation in the international landscape. Accurately assessing its contradictions at the global and regional level open up opportunities for progress. At its heart currently is the US-China dynamic. The determination of Russia, choices of Japan, and durability of Europe are also relevant. A loose coalition of developing countries will play some part going forward, but at the moment it increasingly differentiates on issues of concern. As multipolarity grows and discipline erodes, stronger regionalism can produce outcomes that are beyond the control of major powers. Multilateralism may well take a backseat as rules and norms come under greater scrutiny and the consensus among the permanent 5, US, Russia, China, UK and France, weakens. All in all, this points to more fluidity and unpredictability. In theory at least, this new reality should be welcomed by the beneficiaries. A multipolar world is a demand they have long pressed for. Now that multipolarity is here, its compulsions and responsibilities are making themselves felt. Nations will have to create issue-based relationships that can pull them in different directions. Keeping multiple options open while reconciling commitments to multiple partners takes great skill. There will be convergence with many, but congruence, agreement with none. Finding common areas to engage with multiple power centers will characterize diplomacy. The country that has the least problems in its peer group is the country that will fare the best. India must maximize its gains by reaching out in as many directions as possible. It is not simply about greater ambition, but also about not living in the past. In a world of all against all, India's goal should be to move closer to the strategic sweet spot. The changing nature of global politics has always been what determines the context for national choices. The post-colonial era that followed in the wake of World War II saw India return to the international arena as a sovereign power. Achieving independence ahead of other colonies, it had a first-mover advantage in world affairs for a considerable period. The next shift occurred when India had to respond to the Sino-US rapprochement that was facilitated by Pakistan. It did this by aligning itself with the USSR to a great degree. Economic compulsions and the onset of unipolarity brought the decades of alignment with the USSR to an end and induced further adjustment. The 2005 Indo-US nuclear deal was a symbolic repositioning which helped accelerate India's rise in the global order. In the present, India finds itself at another crossroads, where choices are less clear and risks more complicated. To move ahead, it is necessary that there is satisfactory appreciation of the enormity of the disruption the international system is being subject to. As Indians mull their choices, they must consider their position in the overall flow of modern history. In self-absorbed societies, placing national prospects in the context of global events does not come easily. Being divorced from the larger picture means risking misreading their position or ignoring their destiny. Quote, India's current modernization is one of a series that goes back to the Meiji Restoration in Japan. Even then, Indian nationalists perceived it as the beginning of the revival of Asia, hailing Japan's victory over Russia in 1905. But it was that country's socio-economic transformation that was the really lasting story. The creation of the Soviet Union, emergence of the tiger economies in East Asia and the ASEAN, and finally the rise of China, all saw the rest of Eurasia playing catch-up. Each one of these developments have had their influence on India, sometimes unconsciously so. End quote. India is the only one to have undertaken this journey in a more difficult manner in a democratic vehicle. Politics and sociology aside, India's efforts in the last quarter century reflects goals and objectives that broadly align with those of Asia. Where it differed was in the depth and intensity of change, an evolutionary approach producing fewer sweeping outcomes. Some of the resulting constraints are therefore only now being addressed. Today, foreign policy is an exercise in assessing the disruptions underway and trends that accelerate, mitigate, or counter new directions. The corona pandemic has been another complicating factor. However, as the global framework changes and opens up, as India's own capabilities strengthen, the country has greater freedom than in the past to organize its rise. This process will have its risks that will need careful assessment. Much of the strategy will revolve around creating a more favorable landscape for India, as will changing the global discourse in its favor. The end goal in a volatile world, however, is clear. Many friends, few foes, great goodwill, more influence. That must be achieved through the India way. And with that, we have come to the end of the video. Man, feels like I've run a marathon. Lol. In the name of Anime and Jaishankar, hit the like and subscribe button. Thanks for sticking around, lads. Until next time.